Good morning, boys. Today we move on to the next topic of our book First Flight. After completion of one chapter and two poems, we move on to the second chapter, which is Nelson Mandela, A Long Walk to Freedom. This chapter is an extract from the autobiography of Nelson Mandela. The autobiography was named Long Walk to Freedom. Before the chapter begins, in the introduction of it, we are given some terms to be discussed so that we understand the chapter thoroughly and in a better way. Now this is a bit longer chapter and not a very easy one as well. So I would like you to be very careful while going through the videos and to the notes. Though in case of any doubt, I assure you we are going to discuss it again in our classroom. Okay, moving back to the introduction of the chapter, we begin the chapter with the mention of apartheid. What is apartheid? Apartheid is a policy of racial discrimination which discriminates people based on their race and their color. Then we are given various other exercises to brainstorm, like which country practiced this, where was it practiced, how was the struggle, who won over it, and how many people had gone into that struggle. So majorly in this chapter we are going to discuss the policy of apartheid in South Africa, which was finally put an end to with the President Nelson Mandela, who was the first black president of South Africa. Later on in the book we are given an extract of the news which reports the becoming of president of Nelson Mandela, and later on there is a third exercise which gives us the expressions that are used in the text and their meanings, so that before we go on to discuss the chapter, we are thorough with the expressions that we will be reading there and we do not confuse with the meaning of those expressions. So that I'll be sending you in the notes. You can very first stage go through those expressions so that you have a very fluent reading of the text. Now, moving on to the text begins, or the chapter begins with the swearing-in ceremony as a president of Nelson Mandela. Now, with the notes, I would like to tell you about the author as well before the incidents of the chapter. Nelson Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary, political leader and philanthropist. Philanthropist is one who loves people and who served as president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. He was born on 18 July 1918 in South Africa and he expired on 5th December 2013 when he was 95 years of age in Johannesburg, South Africa. If we talk about this chapter, then this chapter is an extract from Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. South Africans who were treated like slaves by the white rulers who ruled over them. Their freedoms were curtailed by unjust laws passed by the white rulers. After decades of struggle and sacrifices, South Africans were eventually successful in restoring their freedom. They eventually liberated themselves from 3 centuries of colonial rule. Imagine 3 centuries, 300 years of colonial rule. Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president of the first democratically elected non-racial government. The chapter briefly describes the inaugural ceremony and his inaugural address as the President of South Africa. As we begin the chapter, we are given how he enters on 10th May to the Hall of Fame to swear in as the President. There is a description of inaugural ceremony of the first democratically elected non-racial government of South Africa on 10th May 1994. I told you he served as the president from 94 to 99. The African National Congress, the party to which Nelson Mandela belonged, won with 252 seats out of total 400. Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president of South Africa. Now, this inauguration ceremony was held in the Union Buildings in Pretoria. It was attended by various world leaders. Nelson Mandela, when he begins his address, he mentions and he extends his gratitude towards all those who have gathered to witness a new face of South Africa. The gathering signifies the support and the cause of putting an end to apartheid and to oppression. Now, Mr. de Klerk was elected as the second deputy president and Thabo Mbeki as the first deputy president. Nelson Mandela sworn in as the president after the deputy president and the second deputy president. Both the white and the black national anthems were sung at the end of the ceremony, which signified the end of all the racial differences in South Africa. Mandela, in his speech, pledged to uphold the principles of the Constitution. He defined freedom from bondage of poverty, discrimination, deprivation, oppression, and discrimination based on gender, race, class as his ideals for the future of South Africa. Mandela remembered all those freedom fighters in his address who fought before him for the same cause and sacrificed their lives. Some of the names that he mentions are Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Chief Luthuli, Yusuf Dadoo, and various others who sacrificed their life for the liberty of South Africa from the colonial rule. Mandela, in his speech, spoke about the twin obligations of every citizen. Twin obligations means the two duties that we all are bestowed upon us. He mentions the twin obligations to be one towards our family and the second towards our nation. Now, he mentions that there needs to be a balance between both these obligations. But in South Africa, the blacks were not allowed to fulfill both the obligations. If somebody fulfills his obligations towards his family, stays true to the family and stays within the boundary of his family with the restrictions imposed on him or them, then it was okay, but he was not doing the duty towards the nation. And if one fulfills the obligation towards the nation, then he would not be allowed to live life in peace like a reputed citizen. He would be a criminal in that case, and then he would be naturally away from the family, missing his obligation towards the family. That is what provoked Nelson Mandela to fight for the cause. He said that courage is not absence of fear, but victory over it. What do we mean by this? Courage is not that I am never afraid, but when I am afraid and I win over that fear, that is the real courage. That if human beings can be taught to hate, they can also learn to love. If somebody is telling to hate your brethren, your brothers, your fellow beings, your countrymen, then you can yourself unlearn that hatred and learn to love. Because love comes naturally to human beings. Hatred is forced upon us, but love is natural. Towards the end of the chapter, Mandela said that the oppressed and the oppressor both are prisoners of hatred. How? The one who is being oppressed and the one who is overhead and is oppressing the lower section of the society. Both are the prisoners of hatred. None of them is actually free. He says the oppressed is a victim of injustice being done to him because his fundamental rights are being taken away, and the oppressor is a prisoner of his prejudice and of his hatred towards his own fellow being. According to Mandela, real freedom is to enjoy the right to equality and the fundamental right to lead a life with respect and dignity, to have equal rights as all those who live with him have. Now, Nelson Mandela in the chapter Apart from his address and the struggle to freedom struggle and the struggle towards freedom and towards the end, putting an end to this racial policy of apartheid, mentions his childhood days. How does he mention those? He begins saying that I was not born with a hunger to be free. I was born free. As a child, Nelson Mandela says, I was born in a okay middle class family and I was not with a hunger to be free. I felt I am free to roam in the fields, I am free to take a bath in the tube well, I am free to run up to the sky and play with the birds. But when he realized that he is actually not free is when he moved out of that box of his family and of his neighborhood, his home and family boundaries. As a schoolboy, when he realized that there are many things that I cannot have and the others of my age are privileged to enjoy, that is when he felt this hunger for freedom, and that is when he decided to fight for his rights. He remembers and recalls his experience of being able to stay out at night, which was not possible for the blacks in South Africa, because they would then be considered as criminals and they would then be imprisoned, taken by the cops. Later on in Johannesburg, he had different hungers. He had the hunger to marry with his choice. He had the hunger to hang out with his friends. And he also realized that it is not just me who is not free. It is many of my brothers, of my sisters, and of my countrymen, whoever who is like me is free, is not free exactly like me. This is what he recalls, and this is when he says, I wanted to be free. I wanted this hunger to spread through all and all to fight in unison towards the liberty of their own country. Now, after that, Nelson Mandela also mentions in the chapter about the various personalities who supported him in his fight. He says it could not have been possible with one person or with 10 people or with 100 people to win this liberty and to stand here as the president, to be equal in South Africa. He remembers the sacrifice of all his fellow beings. Nelson Mandela says, when I decided to fight for this hunger for freedom, I could not fill my obligation as a man who loved his wife, as a father who would take care of his children, because he was for the first time taken away for being a criminal, for going against the laws, because laws never favored blacks. Laws always favored the white people, and when he was disturbing the arrangement, he was naturally doomed and considered to be a criminal, and he missed the obligation of his family. Though Nelson Mandela mentions that during his fight, he and many other people like him who fought had dark days, had the days of depression, of hopelessness. But he says, whenever we were about to break and step back from this struggle, I would see a ray of hope, a sympathy in the eyes of the guards who would come to capture us. Even when that spark was for 10 seconds, that was enough for us to keep going on. See how beautifully he mentions that in the eyes of those soldiers or those guards or those cops who were controlling us to not create rebel, even when that sympathy and empathy was in their eyes for 10 seconds, that spark was enough for us to go ahead with our rebellion, to earn this freedom for ourselves. Nelson Mandela, towards the end of the chapter, mentions, though I could not complete the obligations for my family, I completed it for my nation, and I made it possible for my brothers to fulfill the twin obligations that I mentioned. And when he walks in Pretoria in that hall to be sworn in as the president, he walks in with his daughter, and that was indeed a proud moment, not just for South Africa but for the entire world, who had fought such rebellions, who had fought such oppression of man over man. Nelson Mandela, towards the end of the chapter, in this extract of his biography, mentions, I could see a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards, perhaps just for a second, but it was enough to reassure me and keep me going. He says man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden but never extinguished. If a person is cruel, that means his kindness, his gesture of humanity are hidden, but his goodness is innate creation of God, which can never be extinguished completely. Nelson Mandela mentions that an oppressor needs to be liberated as an oppressed person needs to be. He mentions they are both the prisoners of hatred and of oppression. Once both are free, only then we have a nation and we have a world of peace to live together in harmony. That's all about the chapter. There must be some intricate and small details which I must have missed, and you will notice while going through word by word reading of this chapter. I would again remind you, it's not a very easy chapter, a bit long and a bit complicated. So please be very careful in your textual reading and in watching of the videos and going through the notes. Thank you. We will follow with the process of doing the question answering exercises.